Before starting to listen to this book, please subscribe to our channel to support this channel and give the chance to upload more books for bookworms. Welcome back to the fascinating world of Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking by Malcolm Gladwell. In this second part, we'll dive deeper into the science of snap judgments and explore how our subconscious minds shape decisions in the blink of an eye. From instinctive insights to the pitfalls of rapid thinking, this audiobook unravels the mysteries of intuition. Stay tuned as we continue this eye-opening journey into the power of thinking without thinking. 3. Taking care of the customer. The sales director of the Flemington Nissan dealership in the central New Jersey town of Flemington is a man named Bob Gollum. Gollum is in his 50s, with short, thinning black hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wears dark, conservative suits so that he looks like a bank manager or a stockbroker. Since starting in the car business more than a decade ago, Gollum has sold, on average, about 20 cars a month, which is more than double what the average car salesman sells. On his desk, Gollum has a row of 5 gold stars, given to him by his dealership in honor of his performance. In the world of car salesmen, Gollum is a virtuoso. Being a successful salesman like Gollum is a task that places extraordinary demands on the ability to thin slice. Someone you've never met walks into your dealership, perhaps about to make what may be one of the most expensive purchases of his or her life. Some people are insecure. Some are nervous. Some know exactly what they want. Some have no idea. Some know a great deal about cars and will be offended by a salesman who adopts a patronizing tone. Some are desperate for someone to take them by the hand and make sense of what seems to them like an overwhelming process. A salesman, if he or she is to be successful, has to gather all of that information, figuring out, say, the dynamic that exists between a husband and a wife, or a father and a daughter, process it, and adjust his or her own behavior accordingly, and do all of that within the first few moments of the encounter. Bob Gollum is clearly the kind of person who seems to do that kind of thin slicing effortlessly. He's the Evelyn Harrison of car selling. He has a quiet, watchful intelligence and a courtly charm. He is thoughtful and attentive. He's a wonderful listener. He has, he says, 3 simple rules that guide his every action. Take care of the customer. Take care of the customer. Take care of the customer. If you buy a car from Bob Gollum, he will be on the phone to you the next day, making sure everything is all right. If you come to the dealership but don't end up buying anything, he'll call you the next day, thanking you for stopping by. You always put on your best face, even if you are having a bad day. You leave that behind, he says. Even if things are horrendous at home, you give the customer your best. When I met Gollum, he took out a thick 3-ring binder filled with the mountain of letters he had received over the years from satisfied customers. Each one of these has a story to tell, he said. He seemed to remember every one. As he flipped through the book, he pointed randomly at a short typewritten letter. Saturday afternoon, late November 1992. A couple. They came in with this glazed look on their faces. I said, "Folks, have you been shopping for cars all day?" They said yes. No one had taken them seriously. I ended up selling them a car, and we had to get it from, I want to say, Rhode Island. We sent a driver 400 miles. They were so happy. He pointed at another letter. This gentleman here. We've delivered 6 cars to him already since 1993, and every time we deliver another car, he writes another letter. There's a lot like that. Here's a guy who lives way down by Keyport, New Jersey, 40 miles away. He brought me up a platter of scallops. There is another even more important reason for Gollum's success, however. He follows, he says, another very simple rule. He may make a million snap judgments about a customer's needs and state of mind, but he tries never to judge anyone on the basis of his or her appearance. He assumes that everyone who walks in the door has the exact same chance of buying a car. "You cannot prejudge people in this business," he said over and over when we met, and each time he used that phrase, his face took on a look of utter conviction. Prejudging is the kiss of death. You have to give everyone your best shot. A green salesperson looks at a customer and says, "This person looks like he can't afford a car," which is the worst thing you can do, because sometimes the most unlikely person is flush, Gollum says. "I have a farmer I deal with, who I've sold all kinds of cars over the years. We seal our deal with a handshake, and he hands me $100 bill and says, 'Bring it out to my farm.' We don't even have to write the order up. Now, if you saw this man, with his coveralls and his cow dung, you'd figure he was not a worthy customer. But in fact, as we say in the trade, he's all cashed up." Or sometimes people see a teenager and they blow him off. Well, then later that night, the teenager comes back with mom and dad, and they pick up a car, and it's the other salesperson that writes them up. What Gollum is saying is that most salespeople are prone to a classic Warren Harding error. They see someone, and somehow they let the first impression they have about that person's appearance drown out every other piece of information they managed to gather in that first instant. Gollum, by contrast, tries to be more selective. He has his antennae out to pick up on whether someone is confident or insecure, knowledgeable or naive, trusting or suspicious, but from that thin slicing flurry he tries to edit out those impressions based solely on physical appearance. The secret of Gollum's success is that he has decided to fight the Warren Harding error. 4. Spotting the sucker. Why does Bob Gollum's strategy work so well? Because Warren Harding errors, it turns out, play an enormous, largely unacknowledged role in the car-selling business. Consider, for example, a remarkable social experiment conducted in the 1990s by a law professor in Chicago named Ian Ayres. Ayres put together a team of 38 people, 18 white men, 7 white women, 8 black women, and 5 black men. Ayres took great pains to make them appear as similar as possible. All were in their mid-20s. All were of average attractiveness. All were instructed to dress in conservative casual wear, the women in blouses, straight skirts, and flat shoes, the men in polo shirts or button-downs, slacks, and loafers. All were given the same cover story. They were instructed to go to a total of 242 car dealerships in the Chicago area and present themselves as college-educated young professionals, sample job, systems analyst at a bank, living in the Tony Chicago neighborhood of Streeterville. Their instructions for what to do were even more specific. They should walk in. They should wait to be approached by a salesperson. "I'm interested in buying this car," they were supposed to say, pointing to the lowest priced car in the showroom. Then, after they heard the salesman's initial offer, they were instructed to bargain back and forth until the salesman either accepted an offer or refused to bargain any further, a process that in almost all cases took about 40 minutes. What Ayres was trying to do was zero in on a very specific question, all other things being absolutely equal. How does skin color or gender affect the price that a salesman in a car dealership offers? The results were stunning. The white men received initial offers from the salesman that were $72.05 above the dealer's invoice, that is, what the dealer paid for the car from the manufacturer. White women got initial offers of $93.05 above invoice. Black women were quoted a price, on average, of $1,195 above invoice. And black men. Their initial offer was $1,687 above invoice. Even after 40 minutes of bargaining, the black men could get the price, on average, down to only $1,551 above invoice. After lengthy negotiations, Ayres's black men still ended up with a price that was nearly $800 higher than Ayres's white men were offered without having to say a word. What should we make of this? Are the car salesmen of Chicago incredible sexists and bigots? That's certainly the most extreme explanation for what happened. In the car selling business, if you can convince someone to pay the sticker price, the price on the window of the car in the showroom, and if you can talk them into the full premium package, with the leather seats and the sound system and the aluminum wheels, you can make as much in commission off that one gullible customer as you might from half a dozen or so customers who are prepared to drive a hard bargain. If you are a salesman, in other words, there is a tremendous temptation to try to spot the sucker. Car salesmen even have a particular word to describe the customers who pay the sticker price. They're called a lay down. One interpretation of Ayers' study is that these car salesmen simply made a blanket decision that women and blacks are laydowns. They saw someone who wasn't a white male and thought to themselves, aha, this person is so stupid and naive that I can make a lot of money off them. This explanation, however, doesn't make much sense. Ayers' black and female car buyers, after all, gave one really obvious sign after another that they weren't stupid and naive. They were college-educated professionals. They had high-profile jobs. They lived in a wealthy neighborhood. They were dressed for success. They were savvy enough to bargain for 40 minutes. Does anything about these facts suggest a sucker? If Ayers' study is evidence of conscious discrimination, then the car salesmen of Chicago are either the most outrageous of bigots, which seems unlikely, or so dense that they were oblivious to every one of those clues, equally unlikely. I think, instead, that there is something more subtle going on here. What if, for whatever reason, experience, car selling lore, what they've heard from other salesmen, they have a strong automatic association between laydowns and women and minorities? What if they link those two concepts in their mind unconsciously, the same way that millions of Americans link the words evil and criminal with African American on the race IAT, so that when women and black people walk through the door, they instinctively think sucker? These salesmen may well have a strong conscious commitment to racial and gender equality, and they would probably insist, up and down, that they were quoting prices based on the most sophisticated reading of their customer's character. But the decisions they made on the spur of the moment as each customer walked through the door was of another sort. This was an unconscious reaction. They were silently picking up on the most immediate and obvious fact about Ayers' car buyers, their sex and their color, and sticking with that judgment even in the face of all manner of new and contradictory evidence. They were behaving just like the voters did in the 1920 presidential election when they took one look at Warren Harding, jumped to a conclusion, and stopped thinking. In the case of the voters, their error gave them one of the worst US presidents ever. In the case of the car salesmen, their decision to quote an outrageously high price to women and blacks alienated people who might otherwise have bought a car. Gollum tries to treat every customer exactly the same because he's aware of just how dangerous snap judgments are when it comes to race and sex and appearance. Sometimes the unprepossessing farmer with his filthy coveralls is actually an enormously rich man with a 4,000-acre spread, and sometimes the teenager is coming back later with mom and dad. Sometimes the young black man has an MBA from Harvard. Sometimes the petite blonde makes the car decisions for her whole family. Sometimes the man with the silver hair and broad shoulders and lantern jaw is a lightweight. So Gollum doesn't try to spot the laydown. He quotes everyone the same price, sacrificing high profit margins on an individual car for the benefits of volume, and word of his fairness has spread to the point where he gets up to a third of his business from the referrals of satisfied customers. Can I simply look at someone and say, this person is going to buy a car? Asks Gollum. You'd have to be pretty darn good to do that, and there's no way I could. Sometimes I get completely taken aback. Sometimes I'll have a guy come in waving a checkbook, saying, I'm here to buy a car today. If the numbers are right, I'll buy a car today. And you know what? 9 times out of 10, he never buys. 5. Think about Dr. King. What should we do about Warren Harding errors? The kinds of biases we're talking about here aren't so obvious that it's easy to identify a solution. If there's a law on the books that says that black people can't drink at the same water fountains as white people, the obvious solution is to change the law. But unconscious discrimination is a little bit trickier. The voters in 1920 didn't think they were being suckered by Warren Harding's good looks any more than Ayers' Chicago car dealers realized how egregiously they were cheating women and minorities, or boards of directors realize how absurdly biased they are in favor of the tall. If something is happening outside of awareness, how on earth do you fix it? The answer is that we are not helpless in the face of our first impressions. They may bubble up from the unconscious, from behind a locked door inside of our brain, but just because something is outside of awareness doesn't mean it's outside of control. It is true, for instance, that you can take the race IAT or the career IAT as many times as you want and try as hard as you can to respond faster to the more problematic categories, and it won't make a whit of difference. But believe it or not, if, before you take the IAT, I were to ask you to look over a series of pictures or articles about people like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or Colin Powell, your reaction time would change. Suddenly it won't seem so hard to associate positive things with black people. I had a student who used to take the IAT every day, Banaji says. It was the first thing he did, and his idea was just to let the data gather as he went. Then this one day, he got a positive association with blacks. And he said, "That's odd. I've never gotten that before, because we've all tried to change our IAT score and we couldn't." But he's a track and field guy, and what he realized is that he'd spent the morning watching the Olympics. Our first impressions are generated by our experiences and our environment, which means that we can change our first impressions. We can alter the way we thin slice by changing the experiences that comprise those impressions. If you are a white person who would like to treat black people as equals in every way, who would like to have a set of associations with blacks that are as positive as those that you have with whites, it requires more than a simple commitment to equality. It requires that you change your life so that you are exposed to minorities on a regular basis and become comfortable with them and familiar with the best of their culture, so that when you want to meet, hire, date, or talk with a member of a minority, you aren't betrayed by your hesitation and discomfort. Taking rapid cognition seriously, acknowledging the incredible power, for good and ill, that first impressions play in our lives, requires that we take active steps to manage and control those impressions. In the next section of this book, I'm going to tell 3 stories about people who confronted the consequences of first impressions and snap judgments. Some were successful. Some were not. But all, I think, provide us with critical lessons of how we can better understand and come to terms with the extraordinary power of thin slicing. 4. Paul Van Riper's Big Victory, Creating Structure for Spontaneity. Paul Van Riper is tall and lean with a gleaming bald dome and wire-rimmed glasses. He walks with his shoulders square and has a gruff, commanding voice. His friends call him Rip. Once when he and his twin brother were 12, they were sitting in a car with their father as he read a newspaper story about the Korean War. "Well, boys," he said, "the war's about to be over. Truman's sending in the Marines." That's when Van Riper decided that when he grew up, he would join the Marine Corps. In his first tour in Vietnam, he was almost cut in half by gunfire while taking out a North Vietnamese machine gun in a rice paddy outside Saigon. In 1968, he returned to Vietnam, and this time he was the commander of my company, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division, in the rice paddy and hill country of South Vietnam between 2 treacherous regions the Marines called Dodge City and the Arizona Territory. There his task was to stop the North Vietnamese from firing rockets into Da Nang. Before he got there, the rocket attacks in his patrol area were happening once or even twice a week. In the 3 months he was in the bush, there was only one. I remember when I first met him like it was yesterday, says Richard Gregory, who was Van Riper's gunnery sergeant in my company. It was between Hill 55 and Hill 10, just southeast of Da Nang. We shook hands. He had that crisp voice, low to middle tones. Very direct. Concise. Confident, without a lot of icing on the cake. That's how he was, and he maintained that every day of the war. He had an office in our combat area, Hooch, but I never saw him in there. He was always out in the field or out near his bunker, figuring out what to do next. If he had an idea and he had a scrap of paper in his pocket, he would write that idea on the scrap, and then, when we had a meeting, he would pull out 7 or 8 little pieces of paper. Once he and I were in the jungle a few yards away from a river, and he wanted to reconnoiter over certain areas, but he couldn't get the view he wanted. The bush was in the way. Damned if he didn't take off his shoes, dive into the river, swim out to the middle, and tread water so he could see downstream. In the first week of November of 1968, my company was engaged in heavy fighting with a much larger North Vietnamese regiment. At one point we called in a medevac to take out some wounded. The helicopter was landing, and the North Vietnamese army was shooting rockets and killing everybody in the command post, remembers John Mason, who was one of the company's platoon commanders. We suddenly had 12 dead Marines. It was bad. We got out of there 3 or 4 days later, and we took a number of casualties, maybe 45 total. But we reached our objective. We got back to Hill 55, and the very next day, we were working on squad tactics and inspection and, believe it or not, physical training. It had never dawned on me as a young lieutenant that we would do PT in the bush. But we did. It did not dawn on me that we would practice platoon and squad tactics or bayonet training in the bush, but we did. And we did it on a routine basis. After a battle, there would be a brief respite, then we would be back to training. That's how Rip ran his company. Van Riper was strict. He was fair. He was a student of war, with clear ideas about how his men ought to conduct themselves in combat. He was a gunslinger, another of his soldiers from my company remembers, somebody who doesn't sit behind a desk but leads the troops from the front. He was always very aggressive, but in such a way that you didn't mind doing what he was asking you to do. I remember one time I was out with a squad on a night ambush. I got a call from the skipper, what Marines call the company commander, on the radio. He told me that there were 121 little people, meaning Vietnamese, heading toward my position, and my job was to resist them. I said, "Skipper, I have 9 men." He said he would bring out a reactionary force if I needed one. That's the way he was. The enemy was out there and there may have been 9 of us and 121 of them, but there was no doubt in his mind that we had to engage them. Wherever the skipper operated, the enemy was put off by his tactics. He was not live and let live. In the spring of 2000, Van Riper was approached by a group of senior Pentagon officials. He was retired at that point, after a long and distinguished career. The Pentagon was in the earliest stages of planning for a war game that they were calling Millennium Challenge 02. It was the largest and most expensive war game thus far in history. By the time the exercise was finally staged, in July and early August of 2002, 2.5 years later, it would end up costing $250 million, which is more than some countries spend on their entire defense budget. According to the Millennium Challenge scenario, a rogue military commander had broken away from his government somewhere in the Persian Gulf and was threatening to engulf the entire region in war. He had a considerable power base from strong religious and ethnic loyalties, and he was harboring and sponsoring 4 different terrorist organizations. He was virulently anti-American. In Millennium Challenge, in what would turn out to be an inspired, or, depending on your perspective, disastrous, piece of casting, Paul Van Riper was asked to play the rogue commander. One morning in the Gulf, The group that runs war games for the US military is called the Joint Forces Command, or, as it is better known, JFCOM. JFCOM occupies two rather nondescript low-slung concrete buildings at the end of a curving driveway in Suffolk, Virginia, a few hours' drive south and east of Washington, D.C. Just before the entrance to the parking lot, hidden from the street, is a small guard hut. A chain-link fence rings the perimeter. There is a Walmart across the street. Inside, JFCOM looks like a very ordinary office building, with conference rooms and rows of cubicles and long, brightly lit carpetless corridors. The business of JFCOM, however, is anything but ordinary. JFCOM is where the Pentagon tests new ideas about military organization and experiments with new military strategies. Planning for the war game began in earnest in the summer of 2000. JFCOM brought together hundreds of military analysts and specialists and software experts. In war game parlance, the United States and its allies are always known as Blue Team, and the enemy is always known as Red Team, and JFCOM generated comprehensive portfolios for each team, covering everything they would be expected to know about their own forces and their adversaries' forces. For several weeks leading up to the game, the Red and Blue forces took part in a series of spiral exercises that set the stage for the showdown. The rogue commander was getting more and more belligerent, the United States more and more concerned. In late July, both sides came to Suffolk and set up shop in the huge, windowless rooms known as test bays on the first floor of the main JFCOM building. Marine Corps, Air Force, Army, and Navy units at various military bases around the country stood by to enact the commands of Red and Blue Team brass. Sometimes when Blue Team fired a missile or launched a plane, a missile actually fired or a plane actually took off, and whenever it didn't, one of 42 separate computer models simulated each of those actions so precisely that the people in the war room often couldn't tell it wasn't real. The game lasted for 2.5 weeks. For future analysis, a team of JFCOM specialists monitored and recorded every conversation, and a computer kept track of every bullet fired and missile launched and tank deployed. This was more than an experiment. As became clear less than a year later, when the United States invaded a Middle Eastern state with a rogue commander who had a strong ethnic power base and was thought to be harboring terrorists, this was a full dress rehearsal for war. The stated purpose of Millennium Challenge was for the Pentagon to test a set of new and quite radical ideas about how to go to battle. In Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the United States had routed the forces of Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. But that was an utterly conventional kind of war, two heavily armed and organized forces meeting and fighting in an open battlefield. In the wake of Desert Storm, the Pentagon became convinced that that kind of warfare would soon be an anachronism. No one would be foolish enough to challenge the United States head-to-head in pure military combat. Conflict in the future would be diffuse. It would take place in cities as often as on battlefields, be fueled by ideas as much as by weapons, and engage cultures and economies as much as armies. As one JFCOM analyst puts it, the next war is not just going to be military on military. The deciding factor is not going to be how many tanks you kill, how many ships you sink, and how many planes you shoot down. The decisive factor is how you take apart your adversary's system. Instead of going after warfighting capability, we have to go after war-making capability. The military is connected to the economic system, which is connected to their cultural system, to their personal relationships. We have to understand the links between all those systems. With Millennium Challenge, then, Blue Team was given greater intellectual resources than perhaps any army in history. JFCOM devised something called the Operational Net Assessment, which was a formal decision-making tool that broke the enemy down into a series of systems, military, economic, social, political, and created a matrix showing how all those systems were interrelated and which of the links among the systems were the most vulnerable. Blue Team's commanders were also given a tool called effects-based operations, which directed them to think beyond the conventional military method of targeting and destroying an adversary's military assets. They were given a comprehensive, real-time map of the combat situation called the Common Relevant Operational Picture, CROP. They were given a tool for joint interactive planning. They were given an unprecedented amount of information and intelligence from every corner of the US government and a methodology that was logical and systematic and rational and rigorous. They had every toy in the Pentagon's arsenal. We looked at the full array of what we could do to affect our adversary's environment: political, military, economic, societal, cultural, institutional. All those things we looked at very comprehensively. The commander of JFCOM, General William F. Kernan, told reporters in a Pentagon press briefing after the war game was over. There are things that the agencies have right now that can interrupt people's capabilities. There are things that you can do to disrupt their ability to communicate, to provide power to their people, to influence their national will, to take out power grids. 2 centuries ago, Napoleon wrote that a general never knows anything with certainty, never sees his enemy clearly, and never knows positively where he is. War was shrouded in fog. The point of Millennium Challenge was to show that, with the full benefit of high-powered satellites and sensors and supercomputers, that fog could be lifted. This is why, in many ways, the choice of Paul Van Riper to head the opposing Red Team was so inspired, because if Van Riper stood for anything, it was the antithesis of that position. Van Riper didn't believe you could lift the fog of war. His library on the 2nd floor of his house in Virginia is lined with rows upon rows of works on complexity theory and military strategy. From his own experiences in Vietnam and his reading of the German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, Van Riper became convinced that war was inherently unpredictable and messy and nonlinear. In the 1980s, Van Riper would often take part in training exercises, and, according to military doctrine, he would be required to perform versions of the kind of analytical, systematic decision-making that JFCOM was testing in Millennium Challenge. He hated it. It took far too long. I remember once, he says, we were in the middle of the exercise. The division commander said, "Stop. Let's see where the enemy is." We'd been at it for 8 or 9 hours, and they were already behind us. The thing we were planning for had changed. It wasn't that Van Riper hated all rational analysis. It's that he thought it was inappropriate in the midst of battle, where the uncertainties of war and the pressures of time made it impossible to compare options carefully and calmly. In the early 1990s, when Van Riper was head of the Marine Corps University at Quantico, Virginia, he became friendly with a man named Gary Klein. Klein ran a consulting firm in Ohio and wrote a book called Sources of Power, which is one of the classic works on decision-making. Klein studied nurses, intensive care units, firefighters, and other people who make decisions under pressure, and one of his conclusions is that when experts make decisions, they don't logically and systematically compare all available options. That is the way people are taught to make decisions, but in real life it is much too slow. Klein's nurses and firefighters would size up a situation almost immediately and act, drawing on experience and intuition and a kind of rough mental simulation. To Van Riper, that seemed to describe much more accurately how people make decisions on the battlefield. Once, out of curiosity, Van Riper and Klein and a group of about a dozen Marine Corps generals flew to the Mercantile Exchange in New York to visit the trading floor. Van Riper thought to himself, "I've never seen this sort of pandemonium except in a military command post in war. We can learn something from this." After the bell rang at the end of the day, the generals went onto the floor and played trading games. Then they took a group of traders from Wall Street across New York Harbor to the military base on Governor's Island and played war games on computers. The traders did brilliantly. The war games required them to make decisive, rapid-fire decisions under conditions of high pressure and with limited information, which is, of course, what they did all day at work. Van Riper then took the traders down to Quantico, put them in tanks, and took them on a live fire exercise. To Van Riper, it seemed clearer and clearer that these overweight, unkempt, long-haired guys and the Marine Corps brass were fundamentally engaged in the same business, the only difference being that one group bet on money and the other bet on lives. I remember the first time the traders met the generals, Gary Klein says. It was at the cocktail party, and I saw something that really startled me. You had all these Marines, these 2- and 3-star generals, and you know what a Marine Corps general is like. Some of them had never been to New York. Then there were all these traders, these brash, young New Yorkers in their 20s and 30s, and I looked at the room and there were groups of 2 and 3, and there was not a single group that did not include members of both sides. They weren't just being polite. They were animatedly talking to each other. They were comparing notes and connecting. I said to myself, these guys are soulmates. They were treating each other with total respect. Millennium Challenge, in other words, was not just a battle between 2 armies. It was a battle between 2 perfectly opposed military philosophies. Blue Team had their databases and matrices and methodologies for systematically understanding the intentions and capabilities of the enemy. Red Team was commanded by a man who looked at a long-haired, unkempt, seat-of-the-pants commodities trader yelling and pushing and making 1,000 instant decisions an hour and saw in him a soulmate. On the opening day of the war game, Blue Team poured tens of thousands of troops into the Persian Gulf. They parked an aircraft carrier battle group just offshore of Red Team's home country. There, with the full weight of its military power in evidence, Blue Team issued an 8-point ultimatum to Van Riper, the 8th point being the demand to surrender. They acted with utter confidence, because their operational net assessment matrices told them where Red Team's vulnerabilities were, what Red Team's next move was likely to be, and what Red Team's range of options was. But Paul Van Riper did not behave as the computers predicted. Blue Team knocked out his microwave towers and cut his fiber optics lines on the assumption that Red Team would now have to use satellite communications and cell phones and they could monitor his communications. They said that Red Team would be surprised by that, Van Riper remembers. Surprised. Any moderately informed person would know enough not to count on those technologies. That's a Blue Team mindset. Who would use cell phones and satellites after what happened to Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan? We communicated with couriers on motorcycles and messages hidden inside prayers. They said, "How did you get your airplanes off the airfield without the normal chatter between pilots and the tower?" I said, "Does anyone remember World War II? We'll use lighting systems." Suddenly the enemy that Blue Team thought could be read like an open book was a bit more mysterious. What was Red Team doing? Van Riper was supposed to be cowed and overwhelmed in the face of a larger foe. But he was too much of a gunslinger for that. On the second day of the war, he put a fleet of small boats in the Persian Gulf to track the ships of the invading Blue Team Navy. Then, without warning, he bombarded them in an hour-long assault with a fusillade of cruise missiles. When Red Team's surprise attack was over, 16 American ships lay at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Had Millennium Challenge been a real war instead of just an exercise, 20,000 American servicemen and women would have been killed before their own army had even fired a shot. As the Red Force commander, I'm sitting there and I realized that Blue Team had said that they were going to adopt a strategy of preemption, Van Riper says. So I struck first. We'd done all the calculations on how many cruise missiles their ships could handle, so we simply launched more than that, from many different directions, from offshore and onshore, from air, from sea. We probably got half of their ships. We picked the ones we wanted. The aircraft carrier. The biggest cruisers. There were 6 amphibious ships. We knocked out 5 of them. In the weeks and months that followed, there were numerous explanations from the analysts at JFCOM about exactly what happened that day in July. Some would say that it was an artifact of the particular way war games are run. Others would say that in real life, the ships would never have been as vulnerable as they were in the game. But none of the explanations changed the fact that Blue Team suffered a catastrophic failure. The Rogue Commander did what Rogue Commanders do. He fought back, yet somehow this fact caught Blue Team by surprise. In a way, it was a lot like the kind of failure suffered by the Getty when it came to evaluating the Kuros. They had conducted a thoroughly rational and rigorous analysis that covered every conceivable contingency, yet that analysis somehow missed a truth that should have been picked up instinctively. In that moment in the Gulf, Red Team's powers of rapid cognition were intact, and Blue Team's were not. How did that happen? The structure of spontaneity. One Saturday evening not long ago, an improvisation comedy group called Mother took the stage in a small theater in the basement of a supermarket on Manhattan's West Side. It was a snowy evening just after Thanksgiving, but the room was full. There are 8 people in Mother, 3 women and 5 men, all in their 20s and 30s. The stage was bare except for a half-dozen white folding chairs. Mother was going to perform what is known in the improv world as a herald. They would get up on stage, without any idea whatsoever of what character they would be playing or what plot they would be acting out, take a random suggestion from the audience, and then, without so much as a moment's consultation, make up a 30-minute play from scratch. One of the group members called out to the audience for a suggestion. "Robots," someone yelled back. In improv, the suggestion is rarely taken literally, and in this case, Jessica, the actress who began the action, said later that the thing that came to mind when she heard the word robots was emotional detachment and the way technology affects relationships. So, right then and there, she walked on stage, pretending to read a bill from the cable television company. There was one other person on stage with her, a man seated in a chair with his back to her. They began to talk. Did he know what character he was playing at that moment? Not at all, nor did she or anyone in the audience. But somehow it emerged that she was the wife, and the man was her husband, and she had found charges on the cable bill for porn movies and was distraught. He, in turn, responded by blaming their teenage son, and after a spirited back and forth, 2 more actors rushed on stage, playing 2 different characters in the same narrative. One was a psychiatrist helping the family with their crisis. In another scene, an actor angrily slumped in a chair. "I'm doing time for a crime I didn't commit," the actor said. He was the couple's son. At no time as the narrative unfolded did anyone stumble or freeze or look lost. The action proceeded as smoothly as if the actors had rehearsed for days. Sometimes what was said and done didn't quite work. But often it was profoundly hilarious, and the audience howled with delight. And at every point it was riveting. Here was a group of 8 people up on a stage without a net, creating a play before our eyes. Improvisation comedy is a wonderful example of the kind of thinking that Blink is about. It involves people making very sophisticated decisions on the spur of the moment, without the benefit of any kind of script or plot. That's what makes it so compelling and, to be frank, terrifying. If I were to ask you to perform in a play that I'd written, before a live audience with a month of rehearsal, I suspect that most of you would say no. What if you got stage fright? What if you forgot your lines? What if the audience booed? But at least a conventional play has structure. Every word and movement has been scripted. Every performer gets to rehearse. There's a director in charge, telling everyone what to do. Now suppose that I were to ask you to perform again before a live audience, only this time without a script, without any clue as to what part you were playing or what you were supposed to say, and with the added requirement that you were expected to be funny. I'm quite sure you'd rather walk on hot coals. What is terrifying about improv is the fact that it appears utterly random and chaotic. It seems as though you have to get up on stage and make everything up, right there on the spot. But the truth is that improv isn't random and chaotic at all. If you were to sit down with the cast of Mother, for instance, and talk to them at length, you'd quickly find out that they aren't all the sort of zany, impulsive, free-spirited comedians that you might imagine them to be. Some are quite serious, even nerdy. Every week they get together for a lengthy rehearsal. After each show they gather backstage and critique each other's performance soberly. Why do they practice so much? Because improv is an art form governed by a series of rules, and they want to make sure that when they're up on stage, everyone abides by those rules. We think of what we're doing as a lot like basketball, one of the Mother players said, and that's an apt analogy. Basketball is an intricate, high-speed game filled with split-second, spontaneous decisions. But that spontaneity is possible only when everyone first engages in hours of highly repetitive and structured practice, perfecting their shooting, dribbling, and passing and running plays over and over again, and agrees to play a carefully defined role on the court. This is the critical lesson of improv, too, and it is also a key to understanding the puzzle of Millennium Challenge: spontaneity isn't random. Paul Van Riper's red team did not come out on top in that moment in the golf because they were smarter or luckier at that moment than their counterparts over at blue team. How good people's decisions are under the fast-moving, high-stress conditions of rapid cognition is a function of training and rules and rehearsal. One of the most important of the rules that make improv possible, for example, is the idea of agreement, the notion that a very simple way to create a story, or humor, is to have characters accept everything that happens to them. As Keith Johnstone, one of the founders of improv theater, writes, "If you'll stop reading for a moment and think of something you wouldn't want to happen to you, or to someone you love, then you'll have thought of something worth staging or filming." We don't want to walk into a restaurant and be hit in the face by a custard pie, and we don't want to suddenly glimpse Granny's wheelchair racing towards the edge of a cliff, but we'll pay money to attend enactments of such events. In life, most of us are highly skilled at suppressing action. All the improvisation teacher has to do is to reverse this skill, and he creates very gifted improvisers. Bad improvisers block action, often with a high degree of skill. Good improvisers develop action. Here, for instance, is an improvised exchange between two actors in a class that Johnstone was teaching. A. I'm having trouble with my leg. B. I'm afraid I'll have to amputate. A. You can't do that, doctor. B. Why not? A. Because I'm rather attached to it. B. Losing heart, come on, man. A. I've got this growth on my arm too, doctor. The two actors involved in this scene quickly became very frustrated. They couldn't keep the scene going. Actor A had made a joke, and a rather clever one, I'm rather attached to it, but the scene itself wasn't funny. So Johnstone stopped them and pointed out the problem. Actor A had violated the rule of agreement. His partner had made a suggestion, and he had turned it down. He had said, "You can't do that, doctor." So the two started again, only this time with a renewed commitment to agreeing. A. Og. B. Whatever is it, man? A. It's my leg, doctor. B. This looks nasty. I shall have to amputate. A. It's the one you amputated last time, doctor. B. You mean you've got a pain in your wooden leg? A. Yes, doctor. B. You know what this means? A. Not woodworm, doctor. B. Yes. We'll have to remove it before it spreads to the rest of you. A's chair collapses. B. My God. It's spreading to the furniture. Here are the same two people, with the same level of skill, playing exactly the same roles, and beginning almost exactly the same way. However, in the first case, the scene comes to a premature end, and in the second case, the scene is full of possibility. By following a simple rule, A and B became funny. Good improvisers seem telepathic, everything looks pre-arranged, John Stone writes. This is because they accept all offers made, which is something no normal person would do. Here's one more example, from a workshop conducted by Del Close, another of the fathers of improv. One actor is playing a police officer, the other a robber he's chasing. Cop, panting, "Hey, I'm 50 years old and a little overweight. Can we stop and rest for a minute?" Robber, panting, "You're not gonna grab me if we rest." Cop, "Promise. Just for a few seconds, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Do you have to be particularly quick-witted or clever or light on your feet to play that scene? Not really. It's a perfectly straightforward conversation. The humor arises entirely out of how steadfastly the participants adhere to the rule that no suggestion can be denied. If you can create the right framework, all of a sudden, engaging in the kind of fluid, effortless, spur-of-the-moment dialogue that makes for good improv theater becomes a lot easier. This is what Paul Van Riper understood in Millennium Challenge. He didn't just put his team up on stage and hope and pray that funny dialogue popped into their heads. He created the conditions for successful spontaneity. 3. The perils of introspection. On Paul Van Riper's first tour in Southeast Asia, when he was out in the bush, serving as an advisor to the South Vietnamese, he would often hear gunfire in the distance. He was then a young lieutenant new to combat, and his first thought was always to get on the radio and ask the troops in the field what was happening. After several weeks of this, however, he realized that the people he was calling on the radio had no more idea than he did about what the gunfire meant. It was just gunfire. It was the beginning of something, but what that something was not yet clear. So Van Riper stopped asking. On his second tour of Vietnam, whenever he heard gunfire, he would wait. "I would look at my watch," Van Riper says, "and the reason I looked was that I wasn't going to do a thing for 5 minutes. If they needed help, they were going to holler. And after 5 minutes, if things had settled down, I still wouldn't do anything." You've got to let people work out the situation and work out what's happening. The danger in calling is that they'll tell you anything to get you off their backs, and if you act on that and take it at face value, you could make a mistake. Plus, you are diverting them. Now they are looking upward instead of downward. You're preventing them from resolving the situation. Van Riper carried this lesson with him when he took over the helm of Red Team. "The first thing I told our staff is that we would be in command and out of control," Van Riper says, echoing the words of the management guru Kevin Kelly. "By that, I mean that the overall guidance and the intent were provided by me and the senior leadership, but the forces in the field wouldn't depend on intricate orders coming from the top. They were to use their own initiative and be innovative as they went forward." Almost every day, the commander of the Red Air Forces came up with different ideas of how he was going to pull this together, using these general techniques of trying to overwhelm Blue Team from different directions. But he never got specific guidance from me of how to do it. Just the intent. Once the fighting started, Van Riper didn't want introspection. He didn't want long meetings. He didn't want explanations. I told our staff that we would use none of the terminology that Blue Team was using. I never wanted to hear that word effects, except in a normal conversation. I didn't want to hear about operational net assessment. We would not get caught up in any of these mechanistic processes. We would use the wisdom, the experience, and the good judgment of the people we had. This kind of management system clearly has its risks. It meant Van Riper didn't always have a clear idea of what his troops were up to. It meant he had to place a lot of trust in his subordinates. It was, by his own admission, a messy way to make decisions. But it had one overwhelming advantage: allowing people to operate without having to explain themselves constantly turns out to be like the rule of agreement in improv. It enables rapid cognition. Let me give you a very simple example of this. Picture, in your mind, the face of the waiter or waitress who served you the last time you ate at a restaurant, or the person who sat next to you on the bus today. Any stranger whom you've seen recently will do. Now, if I were to ask you to pick that person out of a police lineup, could you do it? I suspect you could. Recognizing someone's face is a classic example of unconscious cognition. We don't have to think about it. Faces just pop into our minds. But suppose I were to ask you to take a pen and paper and write down in as much detail as you can what your person looks like. Describe her face. What color was her hair? What was she wearing? Was she wearing any jewelry? Believe it or not, you will now do a lot worse at picking that face out of a lineup. This is because the act of describing a face has the effect of impairing your otherwise effortless ability to subsequently recognize that face. The psychologist Jonathan W. Schooler, who pioneered research on this effect, calls it verbal overshadowing. Your brain has a part, the left hemisphere, that thinks in words, and a part, the right hemisphere, that thinks in pictures, and what happened when you described the face in words was that your actual visual memory was displaced. Your thinking was bumped from the right to the left hemisphere. When you were faced with the lineup the second time around, what you were drawing on was your memory of what you said the waitress looked like, not your memory of what you saw she looked like. And that's a problem because when it comes to faces, we are an awful lot better at visual recognition than we are at verbal description. If I were to show you a picture of Marilyn Monroe or Albert Einstein, you'd recognize both faces in a fraction of a second. My guess is that right now you can see them both almost perfectly in your imagination. But how accurately can you describe them? If you wrote a paragraph on Marilyn Monroe's face, without telling me whom you were writing about, could I guess who it was? We all have an instinctive memory for faces. But by forcing you to verbalize that memory, to explain yourself, I separate you from those instincts. Recognizing faces sounds like a very specific process, but Schooler has shown that the implications of verbal overshadowing carry over to the way we solve much broader problems. Consider the following puzzle. A man and his son are in a serious car accident. The father is killed, and the son is rushed to the emergency room. Upon arrival, the attending doctor looks at the child and gasps, "This child is my son." Who is the doctor? This is an insight puzzle. It's not like a math or a logic problem that can be worked out systematically with pencil and paper. The only way you can get the answer is if it comes to you suddenly in the blink of an eye. You need to make a leap beyond the automatic assumption that doctors are always men. They aren't always, of course. The doctor is the boy's mother. Here's another insight puzzle. A giant inverted steel pyramid is perfectly balanced on its point. Any movement of the pyramid will cause it to topple over. Underneath the pyramid is a $100 bill. How do you remove the bill without disturbing the pyramid? Think about this problem for a few moments. Then, after a minute or so, write down, in as much detail as you can, everything you can remember about how you were trying to solve the problem, your strategy, your approach, or any solutions you've thought of. When Schooler did this experiment with a whole sheet of insight puzzles, he found that people who were asked to explain themselves ended up solving 30% fewer problems than those who weren't. In short, when you write down your thoughts, your chances of having the flash of insight you need in order to come up with a solution are significantly impaired, just as describing the face of your waitress made you unable to pick her out of a police lineup. The solution to the pyramid problem, by the way, is to destroy the bill in some way, tear it or burn it. With a logic problem, asking people to explain themselves doesn't impair their ability to come up with the answers. In some cases, in fact, it may help. But problems that require a flash of insight operate by different rules. It's the same kind of paralysis through analysis you find in sports contexts, Schooler says. When you start becoming reflective about the process, it undermines your ability. You lose the flow. There are certain kinds of fluid, intuitive, nonverbal kinds of experience that are vulnerable to this process. As human beings, we are capable of extraordinary leaps of insight and instinct. We can hold a face in memory, and we can solve a puzzle in a flash. But what Schooler is saying is that all these abilities are incredibly fragile. Insight is not a light bulb that goes off inside our heads. It is a flickering candle that can easily be snuffed out. Gary Klein, the decision-making expert, once did an interview with a fire department commander in Cleveland as part of a project to get professionals to talk about times when they had to make tough, split-second decisions. The story the fireman told was about a seemingly routine call he had taken years before, when he was a lieutenant. The fire was in the back of a one-story house in a residential neighborhood, in the kitchen. The lieutenant and his men broke down the front door, laid down their hose, and then, as firemen say, charged the line, dousing the flames in the kitchen with water. Something should have happened at that point. The fire should have abated. But it didn't. So the men sprayed again. Still, it didn't seem to make much difference. The firemen retreated back through the archway into the living room, and there, suddenly, the lieutenant thought to himself, "There's something wrong." He turned to his men. "Let's get out, now," he said, and moments after they did, the floor on which they had been standing collapsed. The fire, it turned out, had been in the basement. He didn't know why he had ordered everyone out, Klein remembers. He believed it was ESP. He was serious. He thought he had ESP, and he felt that because of that ESP, he'd been protected throughout his career. Klein is a decision researcher with a PhD, a deeply intelligent and thoughtful man, and he wasn't about to accept that as an answer. Instead, for the next 2 hours, again and again he led the firefighter back over the events of that day in an attempt to document precisely what the lieutenant did and didn't know. The first thing was that the fire didn't behave the way it was supposed to, Klein says. Kitchen fires should respond to water. This one didn't. Then they moved back into the living room, Klein went on. He told me that he always keeps his ear flaps up because he wants to get a sense of how hot the fire is, and he was surprised at how hot this one was. A kitchen fire shouldn't have been that hot. I asked him, what else? Often a sign of expertise is noticing what doesn't happen, and the other thing that surprised him was that the fire wasn't noisy. It was quiet, and that didn't make sense given how much heat there was. In retrospect, all those anomalies make perfect sense. The fire didn't respond to being sprayed in the kitchen because it wasn't centered in the kitchen. It was quiet because it was muffled by the floor. The living room was hot because the fire was underneath the living room, and heat rises. At the time, though, the lieutenant made none of those connections consciously. All of his thinking was going on behind the locked door of his unconscious. This is a beautiful example of thin slicing in action. The fireman's internal computer effortlessly and instantly found a pattern in the chaos. But surely the most striking fact about that day is how close it all came to disaster. Had the lieutenant stopped and discussed the situation with his men, had he said to them, "Let's talk this over and try to figure out what's going on," had he done, in other words, what we often think leaders are supposed to do to solve difficult problems, he might have destroyed his ability to jump to the insight that saved their lives. In Millennium Challenge, this is exactly the mistake that Blue Team made. They had a system in place that forced their commanders to stop and talk things over and figure out what was going on. That would have been fine if the problem in front of them demanded logic. But instead, Van Riper presented them with something different. Blue Team thought they could listen to Van Riper's communications. But he started sending messages by couriers on motorcycles. They thought he couldn't launch his planes. But he borrowed a forgotten technique from World War II and used lighting systems. They thought he couldn't track their ships. But he flooded the Gulf with little PT boats. And then, on the spur of the moment, Van Riper's field commanders attacked, and all of a sudden what Blue Team thought was a routine kitchen fire was something they could not factor into their equations at all. They needed to solve an insight problem, but their powers of insight had been extinguished. What I heard is that Blue Team had all these long discussions, Van Riper says. They were trying to decide what the political situation was like. They had charts with up arrows and down arrows. I remember thinking, wait a minute. You were doing that while you were fighting. They had all these acronyms. The elements of national power were diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. That gives you dime. They would always talk about the blue dime. Then there were the political, military, economic, social, infrastructure, and information instruments, MISI. So they'd have these terrible conversations where it would be our dime versus their MISI. I wanted to gag. What are you talking about? You know, you get caught up in forms, in matrices, in computer programs, and it just draws you in. They were so focused on the mechanics and the process that they never looked at the problem holistically. In the act of tearing something apart, you lose its meaning. The operational net assessment was a tool that was supposed to allow us to see all, know all. Major General Dean Cash, one of the senior JFCOM officials involved in the war game, admitted afterward. Well, obviously it failed. 4. A crisis in the ER. On West Harrison Street in Chicago, 2 miles west of the city's downtown, there is an ornate, block-long building designed and built in the early part of the last century. For the better part of 100 years, this was the home of Cook County Hospital. It was here that the world's first blood bank opened, where cobalt beam therapy was pioneered, where surgeons once reattached 4 severed fingers, and where the trauma center was so famous, and so busy treating the gunshot wounds and injuries of the surrounding gangs, that it inspired the television series Yar. In the late 1990s, however, Cook County Hospital started a project that may one day earn the hospital as much acclaim as any of those earlier accomplishments. Cook County changed the way its physicians diagnose patients coming to the ER complaining of chest pain, and how and why they did that offers another way of understanding Paul Van Riper's unexpected triumph in Millennium Challenge. Cook County's big experiment began in 1996, a year after a remarkable man named Brendan Riley came to Chicago to become chairman of the hospital's Department of Medicine. The institution that Riley inherited was a mess. As the city's principal public hospital, Cook County was the place of last resort for the hundreds of thousands of Chicagoans without health insurance. Resources were stretched to the limit. The hospital's cavernous wards were built for another century. There were no private rooms, and patients were separated by flimsy plywood dividers. There was no cafeteria or private telephone, just a payphone for everyone at the end of the hall. In one possibly apocryphal story, doctors once trained a homeless man to do routine lab tests because there was no one else available. In the old days, says one physician at the hospital, if you wanted to examine a patient in the middle of the night, there was only one light switch, so if you turned on the light, the whole ward lit up. It wasn't until the mid-70s that they got individual bed lights. Because it wasn't air-conditioned, they had these big fans, and you can imagine the racket they made. There would be all kinds of police around because Cook County was where they brought patients from the jails, so you'd see prisoners shackled to the beds. The patients would bring in TVs and radios, and they would be blaring, and people would sit out in the hallways like they were sitting on a porch on a summer evening. There was only one bathroom for these hallways filled with patients, so people would be walking up and down, dragging their IVs. Then there were the nurses' bells that you buzzed to get a nurse. But of course there weren't enough nurses, so the bells would constantly be going, ringing and ringing. Try listening to someone's heart or lungs in that setting. It was a crazy place. Riley had begun his medical career at the medical center at Dartmouth College, a beautiful, prosperous state-of-the-art hospital nestled in the breezy, rolling hills of New Hampshire. West Harrison Street was another world. The first summer I was here was the summer of '95, when Chicago had a heat wave that killed hundreds of people, and of course the hospital wasn't air-conditioned, Riley remembers. The heat index inside the hospital was 120. We had patients, sick patients, trying to live in that environment. One of the first things I did was grab one of the administrators and just walk her down the hall and have her stand in the middle of one of the wards. She lasted about 8 seconds. The list of problems Riley faced was endless. But the emergency department, the ED, seemed to cry out for special attention. Because so few Cook County patients had health insurance, most of them entered the hospital through the emergency department, and the smart patients would come first thing in the morning and pack a lunch and a dinner. There were long lines down the hall. The rooms were jammed. A staggering 250,000 patients came through the ED every year. A lot of times, says Riley, I'd have trouble even walking through the ED. It was one gurney on top of another. There was constant pressure about how to take care of these folks. The sick ones had to be admitted to the hospital, and that's when it got interesting. It's a system with constrained resources. How do you figure out who needs what? How do you figure out how to direct resources to those who need them the most? A lot of those people were suffering from asthma, because Chicago has one of the worst asthma problems in the United States. So Riley worked with his staff to develop specific protocols for efficiently treating asthma patients and another set of programs for treating the homeless. But from the beginning, the question of how to deal with heart attacks was front and center. A significant number of those people filing into the ED, on average, about 30 a day, were worried that they were having a heart attack. And those 30 used more than their share of beds and nurses and doctors and stayed around a lot longer than other patients. Chest pain patients were resource intensive. The treatment protocol was long and elaborate and, worst of all, maddeningly inconclusive. A patient comes in clutching his chest. A nurse takes his blood pressure. A doctor puts a stethoscope on his chest and listens for the distinctive crinkling sound that will tell her whether the patient has fluid in his lungs, a sure sign that his heart is having trouble keeping up its pumping responsibilities. She asks him a series of questions. How long have you been experiencing chest pain? Where does it hurt? Are you in particular pain when you exercise? Have you had heart trouble before? What's your cholesterol level? Do you use drugs? Do you have diabetes, which has a powerful association with heart disease? Then a technician comes in, pushing a small device the size of a desktop computer printer on a trolley. She places small plastic stickers with hooks on them at precise locations on the patient's arms and chest. An electrode is clipped to each sticker, which reads the electrical activity of his heart and prints out the pattern on a sheet of pink graph paper. This is the electrocardiogram. In theory, a healthy patient's heart will produce a distinctive and consistent pattern on the page that looks like the profile of a mountain range. And if the patient is having heart trouble, the pattern will be distorted. Lines that usually go up may now be moving down. Lines that once were curved may now be flat or elongated or spiked, and if the patient is in the throes of a heart attack, the ECG readout is supposed to form two very particular and recognizable patterns. The key words, though, are supposed to. The ECG is far from perfect. Sometimes someone with an ECG that looks perfectly normal can be in serious trouble, and sometimes someone with an ECG that looks terrifying can be perfectly healthy. There are ways to tell with absolute certainty whether someone is having a heart attack, but those involve tests of particular enzymes that can take hours for results. And the doctor confronted in the emergency room with a patient in agony and another 100 patients in a line down the corridor doesn't have hours. So when it comes to chest pain, doctors gather as much information as they can, and then they make an estimate. The problem with that estimate, though, is that it isn't very accurate. One of the things Riley did early in his campaign at Cook, for instance, was to put together 20 perfectly typical case histories of people with chest pain and give the histories to a group of doctors, cardiologists, internists, emergency room docs, and medical residents, people, in other words, who had lots of experience making estimates about chest pain. The point was to see how much agreement there was about who among the 20 cases was actually having a heart attack. What Riley found was that there really wasn't any agreement at all. The answers were all over the map. The same patient might be sent home by one doctor and checked into intensive care by another. We asked the doctors to estimate on a scale of 0 to 100 the probability that each patient was having an acute myocardial infarction, heart attack, and the odds that each patient would have a major life-threatening complication in the next 3 days, Riley says. In each case, the answers we got pretty much ranged from 0 to 100. It was extraordinary. The doctors thought they were making reasoned judgments. But in reality they were making something that looked a lot more like a guess, and guessing, of course, leads to mistakes. Somewhere between 2 and 8% of the time in American hospitals, a patient having a genuine heart attack gets sent home, because the doctor doing the examination thinks for some reason that the patient is healthy. More commonly, though, doctors correct for their uncertainty by erring heavily on the side of caution. As long as there is a chance that someone might be having a heart attack, why take even the smallest risk by ignoring her problem? Say you've got a patient who presents to ER complaining of severe chest pain, Riley says. He's old and he smokes and he has high blood pressure. There are lots of things to make you think, gee, it's his heart. But then, after evaluating the patient, you find out his ECG is normal. What do? Well, you probably say to yourself, this is an old guy with a lot of risk factors who's having chest pain. I'm not going to trust the ECG. In recent years, the problem has gotten worse because the medical community has done such a good job of educating people about heart attacks that patients come running to the hospital at the first sign of chest pain. At the same time, the threat of malpractice has made doctors less and less willing to take a chance on a patient, with the result that these days only about 10% of those admitted to a hospital on suspicion of having a heart attack actually have a heart attack. This, then, was Riley's problem. He wasn't back at Dartmouth or over in one of the plush private hospitals on Chicago's north side, where money wasn't an issue. He was at Cook County. He was running the Department of Medicine on a shoestring. Yet every year, the hospital found itself spending more and more time and money on people who were not actually having a heart attack. A single bed in Cook County's coronary care unit, for instance, cost roughly $2,000 a night, and a typical chest pain patient might stay for 3 days, yet the typical chest pain patient might have nothing, at that moment, wrong with him. Is this, the doctors at Cook County asked themselves, any way to run a hospital? The whole sequence began in 1996, Riley says. We just didn't have the number of beds we needed to deal with patients with chest pain. We were constantly fighting about which patient needs what. Cook County at that time had 8 beds in its coronary care unit, and another 12 beds in what's called intermediate coronary care, which is a ward that's a little less intensive and cheaper to run, about $1,000 a night instead of $2,000, and staffed by nurses instead of cardiologists. But that wasn't enough beds. So they opened another section, called the observation unit, where they could put a patient for half a day or so under the most basic care. We created a third, lower-level option and said, let's watch this. Let's see if it helps. But pretty soon what happened is that we started fighting about who gets into the observation unit, Riley went on. I'd be getting phone calls all through the night. It was obvious that there was no standardized, rational way of making this decision. Riley is a tall man with a runner's slender build. He was raised in New York City, the product of a classical Jesuit education, Regis for high school, where he had 4 years of Latin and Greek, and Fordham University for college, where he read everything from the ancients to Wittgenstein and Heidegger and thought about an academic career in philosophy before settling on medicine. Once, as an assistant professor at Dartmouth, Riley grew frustrated with the lack of any sort of systematic textbook on the everyday problems that doctors encounter in the outpatient setting, things like dizziness, headaches, and abdominal pain. So he sat down and, in his free evenings and weekends, wrote an 800-page textbook on the subject, painstakingly reviewing the available evidence for the most common problems a general practitioner might encounter. He's always exploring different topics, whether it's philosophy or Scottish poetry or the history of medicine, says his friend and colleague Arthur Evans, who worked with Riley on the chest pain project. He's usually reading 5 books at once, and when he took a sabbatical leave when he was at Dartmouth, he spent the time writing a novel. No doubt Riley could have stayed on the East Coast, writing one paper after another in air-conditioned comfort on this or that particular problem. But he was drawn to Cook County. The thing about a hospital that serves only the poorest and the neediest is that it attracts the kinds of nurses and doctors who want to serve the poorest and neediest, and Riley was one of those. The other thing about Cook County was that because of its relative poverty, it was a place where it was possible to try something radical, and what better place to go for someone interested in change? Riley's first act was to turn to the work of a cardiologist named Lee Goldman. In the 1970s, Goldman got involved with a group of mathematicians who were very interested in developing statistical rules for telling apart things like subatomic particles. Goldman wasn't much interested in physics, but it struck him that some of the same mathematical principles the group was using might be helpful in deciding whether someone was suffering a heart attack. So he fed hundreds of cases into a computer, looking at what kinds of things actually predicted a heart attack, and came up with an algorithm, an equation, that he believed would take much of the guesswork out of treating chest pain. Doctors, he concluded, ought to combine the evidence of the ECG with 3 of what he called urgent risk factors. 1. Is the pain felt by the patient unstable angina? 2. Is there fluid in the patient's lungs? And 3. Is the patient's systolic blood pressure below 100? For each combination of risk factors, Goldman drew up a decision tree that recommended a treatment option. For example, a patient with a normal ECG who was positive on all 3 urgent risk factors would go to the intermediate unit. A patient whose ECG showed acute ischemia, that is, the heart muscle wasn't getting enough blood, but who had either 1 or no risk factors would be considered low risk and go to the short stay unit. Someone with an ECG positive for ischemia and 2 or 3 risk factors would be sent directly to the cardiac care unit, and so on. Goldman worked on his decision tree for years, steadily refining and perfecting it. But at the end of his scientific articles, there was always a plaintive sentence about how much more hands-on, real-world research needed to be done before the decision tree could be used in clinical practice. As the years passed, however, no one volunteered to do that research, not even at Harvard Medical School, where Goldman began his work, or at the equally prestigious University of California at San Francisco, where he completed it. For all the rigor of his calculations, it seemed that no one wanted to believe what he was saying, that an equation could perform better than a trained physician. Ironically, a big chunk of the funding for Goldman's initial research had come not from the medical community itself but from the Navy. Here was a man trying to come up with a way to save lives and improve the quality of care in every hospital in the country and save billions of dollars in healthcare costs, and the only group that got excited was the Pentagon. Why? For the most arcane of reasons. If you are in a submarine at the bottom of the ocean, quietly snooping in enemy waters, and one of your sailors starts suffering from chest pain, you really want to know whether you need to surface and give away your position in order to rush him to a hospital or whether you can stay underwater and just send him to his bunk with a couple of Rolaids. But Riley shared none of the medical community's qualms about Goldman's findings. He was in a crisis. He took Goldman's algorithm, presented it to the doctors in the Cook County ED and the doctors in the Department of Medicine, and announced that he was holding a bake-off. For the first few months, the staff would use their own judgment in evaluating chest pain, the way they always had. Then they would use Goldman's algorithm, and the diagnosis and outcome of every patient treated under the two systems would be compared. For 2 years, data were collected, and in the end, the result wasn't even close. Goldman's rule won hands down in 2 directions. It was a whopping 70% better than the old method at recognizing the patients who weren't actually having a heart attack. At the same time, it was safer. The whole point of chest pain prediction is to make sure that patients who end up having major complications are assigned right away to the coronary and intermediate units. Left to their own devices, the doctors guessed right on the most serious patients somewhere between 75 and 89% of the time. The algorithm guessed right more than 95% of the time. For Riley, that was all the evidence he needed. He went to the ED and changed the rules. In 2001, Cook County Hospital became one of the first medical institutions in the country to devote itself full-time to the Goldman algorithm for chest pain, and if you walk into the Cook County ER, you'll see a copy of the heart attack decision tree posted on the wall. 5. When less is more. Why is the Cook County experiment so important? Because we take it as a given that the more information decision makers have, the better off they are. If the specialist we are seeing says she needs to do more tests or examine us in more detail, few of us think that's a bad idea. In Millennium Challenge, Blue Team took it for granted that because they had more information at their fingertips than Red Team did, they had a considerable advantage. This was the second pillar of Blue Team's aura of invincibility. They were more logical and systematic than Van Riper, and they knew more. But what does the Goldman algorithm say? Quite the opposite, that all that extra information isn't actually an advantage at all, that, in fact, you need to know very little to find the underlying signature of a complex phenomenon. All you need is the evidence of the ECG, blood pressure, fluid in the lungs, and unstable angina. That's a radical statement. Take, for instance, the hypothetical case of a man who comes into the ER complaining of intermittent left-side chest pain that occasionally comes when he walks up the stairs and that lasts from 5 minutes to 3 hours. His chest exam, heart exam, and ECG are normal, and his systolic blood pressure is 165, meaning it doesn't qualify as an urgent factor. But he's in his 60s. He's a hard-charging executive. He's under constant pressure. He smokes. He doesn't exercise. He's had high blood pressure for years. He's overweight. He had heart surgery 2 years ago. He's sweating. It certainly seems like he ought to be admitted to the coronary care unit right away. But the algorithm says he shouldn't be. All those extra factors certainly matter in the long term. The patient's condition and diet and lifestyle put him at serious risk of developing heart disease over the next few years. It may even be that those factors play a very subtle and complex role in increasing the odds of something happening to him in the next 72 hours. What Goldman's algorithm indicates, though, is that the role of those other factors is so small in determining what is happening to the man right now that an accurate diagnosis can be made without them. In fact, and this is a key point in explaining the breakdown of Blue Team that day in the Gulf, that extra information is more than useless. It's harmful. It confuses the issues. What screws up doctors when they are trying to predict heart attacks is that they take too much information into account. The problem of too much information also comes up in studies of why doctors sometimes make the mistake of missing a heart attack entirely, of failing to recognize when someone is on the brink of or in the midst of a major cardiac complication. Physicians, it turns out, are more likely to make this kind of mistake with women and minorities. Why is that? Gender and race are not irrelevant considerations when it comes to heart problems. Blacks have a different overall risk profile than whites, and women tend to have heart attacks much later in life than men. The problem arises when the additional information of gender and race is factored into a decision about an individual patient. It serves only to overwhelm the physician still further. Doctors would do better in these cases if they knew less about their patients, if, that is, they had no idea whether the people they were diagnosing were white or black, male or female. It is no surprise that it has been so hard for Goldman to get his ideas accepted. It doesn't seem to make sense that we can do better by ignoring what seems like perfectly valid information. This is what opens the decision rule to criticism, Riley says. This is precisely what docs don't trust. They say, this process must be more complicated than just looking at an ECG and asking these few questions. Why doesn't this include whether the patient has diabetes? How old he is? Whether he's had a heart attack before? These are obvious questions. They look at it and say, this is nonsense, this is not how you make decisions. Arthur Evans says that there is a kind of automatic tendency among physicians to believe that a life or death decision has to be a difficult decision. Doctors think it's mundane to follow guidelines, he says. It's much more gratifying to come up with a decision on your own. Anyone can follow an algorithm. There is a tendency to say, well, certainly I can do better. It can't be this simple and efficient, otherwise, why are they paying me so much money? The algorithm doesn't feel right. Many years ago, a researcher named Stuart Oskamp conducted a famous study in which he gathered together a group of psychologists and asked each of them to consider the case of a 29-year-old war veteran named Joseph Kidd. In the first stage of the experiment, he gave them just basic information about Kidd. Then he gave them 1.5 single-spaced pages about his childhood. In the third stage, he gave each person 2 more pages of background on Kidd's high school and college years. Finally, he gave them a detailed account of Kidd's time in the Army and his later activities. After each stage, the psychologists were asked to answer a 25-item multiple-choice test about Kidd. Oskamp found that as he gave the psychologists more and more information about Kidd, their confidence in the accuracy of their diagnoses increased dramatically. But were they really getting more accurate? As it turns out, they weren't. With each new round of data, they would go back over the test and change their answers to 8 or 9 or 10 of the questions, but their overall accuracy remained pretty constant at about 30%. As they received more information, Oskamp concluded, their certainty about their own decisions became entirely out of proportion to the actual correctness of those decisions. This is the same thing that happens with doctors in the ER. They gather and consider far more information than is truly necessary because it makes them feel more confident, and with someone's life in the balance, they need to feel more confident. The irony, though, is that that very desire for confidence is precisely what ends up undermining the accuracy of their decision. They feed the extra information into the already overcrowded equation they are building in their heads, and they get even more muddled. What Riley and his team at Cook County were trying to do, in short, was provide some structure for the spontaneity of the ER. The algorithm is a rule that protects the doctors from being swamped with too much information, the same way that the rule of agreement protects improv actors when they get up on stage. The algorithm frees doctors to attend to all of the other decisions that need to be made in the heat of the moment. If the patient isn't having a heart attack, what is wrong with him? Do I need to spend more time with this patient or turn my attention to someone with a more serious problem? How should I talk to and relate to him? What does this person need from me to get better? One of the things Brendan tries to convey to the house staff is to be meticulous in talking to patients and listening to them and giving a very careful and thorough physical examination, skills that have been neglected by many training programs. Evans says he feels strongly that those activities have intrinsic value in terms of connecting you to another person. He thinks it's impossible to care for someone unless you know about their circumstances, their home, their neighborhood, their life. He thinks that there are a lot of social and psychological aspects to medicine that physicians don't pay enough attention to. Riley believes that a doctor has to understand the patient as a person, and if you believe in the importance of empathy and respect in the doctor-patient relationship, you have to create a place for that. To do so, you have to relieve the pressure of decision-making in other areas. There are, I think, two important lessons here. The first is that truly successful decision-making relies on a balance between deliberate and instinctive thinking. Bob Gollum is a great car salesman because he is very good, in the moment, at intuiting the intentions and needs and emotions of his customers. But he is also a great salesman because he understands when to put the brakes on that process, when to consciously resist a particular kind of snap judgment. Cook County's doctors, similarly, function as well as they do in the day-to-day rush of the ER because Lee Goldman sat down at his computer and over the course of many months painstakingly evaluated every possible piece of information that he could. Deliberate thinking is a wonderful tool when we have the luxury of time, the help of a computer, and a clearly defined task, and the fruits of that type of analysis can set the stage for rapid cognition. The second lesson is that in good decision-making, frugality matters. John Gottman took a complex problem and reduced it to its simplest elements. Even the most complicated of relationships and problems, he showed, have an identifiable underlying pattern. Lee Goldman's research proves that in picking up these sorts of patterns, less is more. Overloading the decision makers with information, he proves, makes picking up that signature harder, not easier. To be a successful decision maker, we have to edit. When we thin slice, when we recognize patterns and make snap judgments, we do this process of editing unconsciously. When Thomas Hoving first saw the Kuros, the thing his eyes were drawn to was how fresh it looked. Federico Zeri focused instinctively on the fingernails. In both cases, Hoving and Zeri brushed aside 1,000 other considerations about the way the sculpture looked and zeroed in on a specific feature that told them everything they needed to know. I think we get in trouble when this process of editing is disrupted, when we can't edit, or we don't know what to edit, or our environment doesn't let us edit. Remember Sheena Iyengar, who did the research on speed dating? She once conducted another experiment in which she set up a tasting booth with a variety of exotic gourmet jams at the upscale grocery store Draeger's in Menlo Park, California. Sometimes the booth had 6 different jams, and sometimes Iyengar had 24 different jams on display. She wanted to see whether the number of jam choices made any difference in the number of jams sold. Conventional economic wisdom, of course, says that the more choices consumers have, the more likely they are to buy, because it is easier for consumers to find the jam that perfectly fits their needs. But Iyengar found the opposite to be true. 30% of those who stopped by the 6-choice booth ended up buying some jam, while only 3% of those who stopped by the bigger booth bought anything. Why is that? Because buying jam is a snap decision. You say to yourself, instinctively, I want that one. And if you are given too many choices, if you are forced to consider much more than your unconscious is comfortable with, you get paralyzed. Snap judgments can be made in a snap because they are frugal, and if we want to protect our snap judgments, we have to take steps to protect that frugality. This is precisely what Van Riper understood with Red Team. He and his staff did their analysis. But they did it first, before the battle started. Once hostilities began, Van Riper was careful not to overload his team with irrelevant information. Meetings were brief. Communication between headquarters and the commanders in the field was limited. He wanted to create an environment where rapid cognition was possible. Blue Team, meanwhile, was gorging on information. They had a database, they boasted, with 40,000 separate entries in it. In front of them was the crop, a huge screen showing the field of combat in real time. Experts from every conceivable corner of the US government were at their service. They were seamlessly connected to the commanders of the 4 military services in a state-of-the-art interface. They were the beneficiaries of a rigorous ongoing series of analyses about what their opponents' next moves might be. But once the shooting started, all of that information became a burden. I can understand how all the concepts that Blue was using translate into planning for an engagement, Van Riper says. But does it make a difference in the moment? I don't believe it does. When we talk about analytic versus intuitive decision-making, neither is good or bad. What is bad is if you use either of them in an inappropriate circumstance. Suppose you had a rifle company pinned down by machine gun fire. And the company commander calls his troops together and says, "We have to go through the command staff with the decision-making process." That's crazy. He should make a decision on the spot, execute it, and move on. If we had had Blue's processes, everything we did would have taken twice as long, maybe 4 times as long. The attack might have happened 6 or 8 days later. The process draws you in. You disaggregate everything and tear it apart, but you are never able to synthesize the whole. It's like the weather. A commander does not need to know the barometric pressure or the winds or even the temperature. He needs to know the forecast. If you get too caught up in the production of information, you drown in the data. Paul Van Riper's twin brother, James, also joined the Marine Corps, rising to the rank of colonel before his retirement, and, like most of the people who know Paul Van Riper well, he wasn't at all surprised at the way Millennium Challenge turned out. Some of these new thinkers say if we have better intelligence, if we can see everything, we can't lose, Colonel Van Riper said. What my brother always says is, "Hey, say you are looking at a chessboard. Is there anything you can't see? No. But are you guaranteed to win? Not at all, because you can't see what the other guy is thinking." More and more commanders want to know everything, and they get imprisoned by that idea. They get locked in. But you can never know everything. Did it really matter that Blue Team was many times the size of Red Team? It's like Gulliver's Travels, Colonel Van Riper says. The big giant is tied down by those little rules and regulations and procedures. And the little guy, he just runs around and does what he wants. 6. Millennium Challenge, Part 2. For a day and a half after Red Team's surprise attack on Blue Team in the Persian Gulf, an uncomfortable silence fell over the JFCOM facility. Then the JFCOM staff stepped in. They turned back the clock. Blue Team's 16 lost ships, which were lying at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, were refloated. In the first wave of his attack, Van Riper had fired 12 theater ballistic missiles at various ports in the Gulf region where Blue Team troops were landing. Now, JFCOM told him all 12 of those missiles had been shot down, miraculously and mysteriously, with a new kind of missile defense. Van Riper had assassinated the leaders of the pro-US countries in the region. Now, he was told those assassinations had no effect. The day after the attack, I walked into the command room and saw the gentleman who was my number 2 giving my team a completely different set of instructions, Van Riper said. It was things like, shut off the radar so Blue Force are not interfered with. Move ground forces so Marines can land without any interference. I asked, can I shoot down one V-22? And he said, no, you can't shoot down any V-22s. I said, what the hell's going on in here? He said, sir, I've been given guidance by the program director to give completely different directions. The second round was all scripted, and if they didn't get what they liked, they would just run it again. Millennium Challenge, the sequel, was won by Blue Team in a rout. There were no surprises the second time around, no insight puzzles, no opportunities for the complexities and confusion of the real world to intrude on the Pentagon's experiment. And when the sequel was over, the analysts at JFCOM and the Pentagon were jubilant. The fog of war had been lifted. The military had been transformed, and with that, the Pentagon confidently turned its attention to the real Persian Gulf. A rogue dictator was threatening the stability of the region. He was virulently anti-American. He had a considerable power base from strong religious and ethnic loyalties and was thought to be harboring terrorist organizations. He needed to be replaced and his country restored to stability, and if they did it right, if they had crop and misai and dime, how hard could that be? 5. Kenna's dilemma, the right and wrong way to ask people what they want. The rock musician known as Kenna grew up in Virginia Beach, the child of Ethiopian immigrants. His father got his degree from Cambridge University and was an economics professor. As a family, they watched Peter Jennings and CNN, and if music was played, it was Kenny Rogers. My father loves Kenny Rogers because he had a message to tell in that song, The Gambler, Kenna explains. Everything was about learning lessons and money and how the world worked. My parents wanted me to do better than they did. Occasionally, Kenna's uncle would visit and expose Kenna to different things, such as disco or dancing or Michael Jackson. And Kenna would look at him and say, "I don't understand." Kenna's main interest was skateboarding. He built a ramp in the backyard, and he would play with a boy from across the street. Then one day his neighbor showed him his bedroom, and on the walls were pictures of bands Kenna had never heard of. The boy gave Kenna a tape of U2's The Joshua Tree. "I destroyed that tape, I played it so much," Kenna says. "I just didn't know. It never dawned on me that music was like this. I think I was 11 or 12, and that was that. Music opened the door." Kenna is very tall and strikingly handsome, with a shaved head and a goatee. He looks like a rock star, but he has none of a rock star's swagger and braggadocio and stodginess. There is something gentle about him. He is polite and thoughtful and unexpectedly modest, and he talks with the quiet earnestness of a graduate student. When Kenna got one of his first big breaks and opened at a rock concert for the well-respected band No Doubt, he either forgot to tell the audience his name, which is how his manager tells it, or decided against identifying himself, which is how he tells it. "Who are you?" the fans were yelling by the end. Kenna is the sort of person who is constantly at odds with your expectations, and that is both one of the things that make him so interesting and one of the things that have made his career so problematic. By his mid-teens, Kenna had taught himself to play piano. He wanted to learn how to sing, so he listened to Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye. He entered a talent show. There was a piano at the audition but not at the show, so he got up on stage and sang a Brian McKnight song a cappella. He started writing music. He scraped together some money to rent a studio. He recorded a demo. His songs were different, not weird, exactly, but different. They were hard to classify. Sometimes people want to put Kenna in the rhythm and blues category, which irritates him because he thinks people do that just because he's black. If you look at some of the internet servers that store songs, you can sometimes find his music in the alternatives section and sometimes in the electronica section and sometimes in the unclassified section. One enterprising rock critic has tried to solve the problem simply by calling his music a cross between the British new wave music of the 1980s and hip-hop. How to classify Kenna is a difficult question, but, at least in the beginning, it wasn't one that he thought about a great deal. Through a friend from high school, he was lucky enough to get to know some people in the music business. "In my life, everything seems to fall in place," Kenna says. His songs landed in the hands of a so-called A&R man, a talent scout for a record company, and through that contact, his demo CD landed in the hands of Craig Coleman, the co-president of Atlantic Records. That was a lucky break. Coleman is a self-described music junkie with a personal collection of 200,000 records and CDs. In the course of a week, he he might be given between 100 and 200 songs by new artists, and every weekend he sits at home, listening to them one after another. The overwhelming majority of those, he realizes in an instant, aren't going to work. In 5 to 10 seconds, he'll have popped them out of his CD player. But every weekend, there are at least a handful that catch his ear, and once in a blue moon, there is a singer or a song that makes him jump out of his seat. That's what Kenna was. I was blown away, Coleman remembers. I thought, I've got to meet this guy. I brought him immediately to New York. He sang for me, literally, like this, and here Coleman gestures with his hand to indicate a space of no more than 2 feet, face to face. Later, Kenna happened to be in a recording studio with one of his friends, who is a producer. There was a man there named Danny Wimmer who worked with Fred Durst, the lead singer of a band called Limp Bizkit, which was then one of the most popular rock groups in the country. Danny listened to Kenna's music. He was entranced. He called Durst and played him one of Kenna's songs, Free Time, over the phone. Durst said, "Sign him." Then Paul McGuinness, the manager of U2, the world's biggest rock band, heard Kenna's record and flew him to Ireland for a meeting. Next, Kenna made a music video for Next to Nothing for one of his songs and took it to MTV2, the MTV channel for more serious music lovers. Record companies spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on promotion, trying to get their videos on MTV, and if they can get them broadcast 100 or 200 times, they consider themselves very lucky. Kenna walked his video over to MTV himself, and MTV ended up playing it 475 times over the next few months. Kenna then made a complete album. He gave it to Coleman again, and Coleman gave the album to all of his executives at Atlantic. Everyone wanted it, Coleman remembers. That's amazingly unusual. Soon after Kenna's success opening for No Doubt, his manager got a call from the Roxy, a nightclub in Los Angeles that is prominent in the city's rock music scene. Did Kenna want to play the following night? Yes, he said, and then posted a message on his website, announcing his appearance. That was at 4:30 the day before the show. By the next afternoon, we got a call from the Roxy. They were turning people away. I figured we'd have at most 100 people, Kenna says. It was jam-packed, and the people up front were singing along to all the lyrics. It tripped me out. In other words, people who truly know music, the kind of people who run record labels, go to clubs, and know the business well, love Kenna. They hear one of his songs, and, in the blink of an eye, they think, wow. More precisely, they hear Kenna and their instinct is that he is the kind of artist whom other people, the mass audience of music buyers, are going to like. But this is where Kenna runs into a problem, because whenever attempts have been made to verify this instinct that other people are going to like him, other people haven't liked him. When Kenna's album was making the rounds in New York, being considered by music industry executives, on 3 separate occasions it was given to an outside market research firm. This is common practice in the industry. In order to be successful, an artist has to get played on the radio. And radio stations will play only a small number of songs that have been proven by market research to appeal, immediately and overwhelmingly, to their audience. So, before they commit millions of dollars to signing an artist, record companies will spend a few $1,000s to test his or her music first, using the same techniques as the radio stations. There are firms, for example, that post new songs on the web and then collect and analyze the ratings of anyone who visits the website and listens to the music. Other companies play songs over the phone or send sample CDs to a stable of raters. Hundreds of music listeners end up voting on particular songs, and over the years the rating systems have become extraordinarily sophisticated. Pick the Hits, for instance, a rating service outside Washington, D.C., has a base of 200,000 people who from time to time rate music, and they have learned that if a song aimed, say, at top 40 radio, listeners 18 to 24, averages above 3.0 on a score of 1 to 4, where 1 is, I dislike the song, there's roughly an 85% chance that it will be a hit. These are the kinds of services that Kenna's record was given to, and the results were dismal. Music Research, a California-based firm, sent Kenna's CD to 1,200 people pre-selected by age, gender, and ethnicity. They then called them up 3 days later and interviewed as many as they could about what they thought of Kenna's music on a scale of 0 to 4. The response was, as the conclusion to the 25-page Kenna report stated politely, subdued. One of his most promising songs, Free Time, came in at 1.3 among listeners to rock stations and 0.8 among listeners to Randy B stations. Pick the Hits rated every song on the album, with 2 scoring average ratings and 8 scoring below average. The conclusion was even more blunt this time. Kenna, as an artist, and his songs lack a core audience and have limited potential to gain significant radio airplay. Kenna once ran into Paul McGuinness, the manager of U2, backstage at a concert. "This man right here," McGuinness said, pointing at Kenna, "he's going to change the world." That was his instinctive feeling, and the manager of a band like U2 is a man who knows music. But the people whose world Kenna was supposed to be changing, it seemed, couldn't disagree more, and when the results of all of the consumer research came in, Kenna's once promising career suddenly stalled. To get on the radio, there had to be hard evidence that the public liked him, and the evidence just wasn't there. 1. A second look at first impressions. In Behind the Oval Office, his memoir of his years as a political pollster, Dick Morris writes about going to Arkansas in 1977 to meet with the state's 31-year-old attorney general, an ambitious young man by the name of Bill Clinton. I explained that I got this idea from the polling my friend Dick Dresner had done for the movie industry. Before a new James Bond movie or a sequel to a film like Jaws came out, a film company would hire Dresner to summarize the plot and then ask people whether they wanted to see the movie. Dresner would read respondents' proposed PR blurbs and slogans about the movie to find out which ones worked the best. Sometimes he even read them different endings or described different places where the same scenes were shot to see which they preferred. "And you just apply these techniques to politics?" Clinton asked. I explained how it could be done. Why not do the same thing with political ads? Or speeches? Or arguments about the issues? And after each statement, ask them again whom they're going to vote for. Then you can see which arguments move how many voters and which voters they move. We talked for almost 4 hours and ate lunch at his desk. I showed the Attorney General sample polls I'd done. He was fascinated by the process. Here was a tool he could use, a process that could reduce the mysterious ways of politics to scientific testing and evaluation. Morris would go on to become a key advisor to Clinton when Clinton became president, and many people came to view his obsession with polling as deeply problematic, as a corruption of the obligation of elected officials to provide leadership and act upon principle. In truth, that's a little harsh. Morris was simply bringing to the world of politics the very same notions that guide the business world. Everyone wants to capture the mysterious and powerful reactions we have to the world around us. The people who make movies or detergent or cars or music all want to know what we think of their products. That's why it wasn't enough for the people in the music business who loved Kenna to act on their gut feelings. Gut feelings about what the public wants are too mysterious and too iffy. Kenna was sent to the market researchers because it seems as though the most accurate way to find out how consumers feel about something is to ask them directly. But is that really true? If we had asked the students in John Bargas' experiment why they were standing in the hall so patiently after they had been primed to be polite, they wouldn't have been able to tell us. If we had asked the Iowa gamblers why they were favoring cards from the blue decks, they wouldn't have been able to say, at least not until they had drawn 80 cards. Sam Gosling and John Gottman found that we can learn a lot more about what people think by observing their body language or facial expressions or looking at their bookshelves and the pictures on their walls than by asking them directly. And Vic Braden discovered that while people are very willing and very good at volunteering information explaining their actions, those explanations, particularly when it comes to the kinds of spontaneous opinions and decisions that arise out of the unconscious, aren't necessarily correct. In fact, it sometimes seems as if they are just plucked out of thin air. So, when marketers ask consumers to give them their reactions to something, to explain whether they liked a song that was just played or a movie they just saw or a politician they just heard, how much trust should be placed in their answers? Finding out what people think of a rock song sounds as if it should be easy. But the truth is that it isn't, and the people who run focus groups and opinion polls haven't always been sensitive to this fact. Getting to the bottom of the question of how good Kenna really is requires a more searching exploration of the intricacies of our snap judgments. 2. Pepsi's challenge. In the early 1980s, the Coca-Cola Company was profoundly nervous about its future. Once, Coke had been far and away the dominant soft drink in the world. But Pepsi had been steadily chipping away at Coke's lead. In 1972, 18% of soft drink users said they drank Coke exclusively, compared with 4% who called themselves exclusive Pepsi drinkers. By the early 1980s, Coke had dropped to 12% and Pepsi had risen to 11%, and this despite the fact that Coke was much more widely available than Pepsi and spending at least $100 million more on advertising per year. In the midst of this upheaval, Pepsi began running television commercials around the country, pitting Coke head-to-head with Pepsi in what they called the Pepsi Challenge. Dedicated Coke drinkers were asked to take a sip from 2 glasses, one marked Q and one marked M. Which did they prefer? Invariably, they would say M, and, lo and behold, M would be revealed as Pepsi. Coke's initial reaction to the Pepsi Challenge was to dispute its findings. But when they privately conducted blind head-to-head taste tests of their own, they found the same thing. When asked to choose between Coke and Pepsi, the majority of tasters, 57%, preferred Pepsi. A 57 to 43% edge is a lot, particularly in a world where millions of dollars hang on a tenth of a percentage point, and it is not hard to imagine how devastating this news was to Coca-Cola management. The Coca-Cola mystique had always been based on its famous secret formula, unchanged since the earliest days of the company. But here was seemingly incontrovertible evidence that time had passed Coke by. Coca-Cola executives next did a flurry of additional market research projects. The news seemed to get worse. Maybe the principal characteristics that made Coke distinctive, like its bite, consumers now describe as harsh, the company's head of American operations, Brian Dyson, said at the time. And when you mention words like rounded and smooth, they say Pepsi. Maybe the way we assuage our thirst has changed. The head of Coke's consumer marketing research department in those years was a man named Roy Stout, and Stout became one of the leading advocates in the company for taking the results of the Pepsi Challenge seriously. If we have twice as many vending machines, have more shelf space, spend more on advertising, and are competitively priced, why are we losing market share? He asked Coke's top management. You look at the Pepsi Challenge, and you have to begin asking about taste. This was the genesis of what came to be known as New Coke. Coke scientists went back and tinkered with the fabled secret formula to make it a little lighter and sweeter, more like Pepsi. Immediately Coke's market researchers noticed an improvement. In blind tastes of some of the early prototypes, Coke pulled even with Pepsi. They tinkered some more. In September of 1984, they went back out and tested what would end up as the final version of New Coke. They rounded up not just thousands but hundreds of thousands of consumers all across North America, and in head-to-head blind taste tests, New Coke beat Pepsi by 6 to 8 percentage points. Coca-Cola executives were elated. the new drink was given the green light. In the press conference announcing the launch of New Coke, the company's CEO, Roberto C. Goizueta, called the new product the surest move the company's ever made, and there seemed little reason to doubt what he said. Consumers, in the simplest and most direct manner imaginable, had been asked for their reaction, and they had said they didn't much like the old Coke, but they very much liked the new Coke. How could New Coke fail? But it did. It was a disaster. Coke drinkers rose up in outrage against New Coke. There were protests around the country. Coke was plunged into crisis, and just a few months later, the company was forced to bring back the original formula as Classic Coke, at which point, sales of New Coke virtually disappeared. The predicted success of New Coke never materialized. But there was an even bigger surprise. The seemingly inexorable rise of Pepsi, which had also been so clearly signaled by market research, never materialized either. For the last 20 years, Coke has gone head-to-head with Pepsi with a product that taste tests say is inferior, and Coke is still the #1 soft drink in the world. The story of New Coke, in other words, is a really good illustration of how complicated it is to find out what people really think. 3. The blind leading the blind. The difficulty with interpreting the Pepsi challenge findings begins with the fact that they were based on what the industry calls a sip test or a CLT, central location test. Tasters don't drink the entire can. They take a sip from a cup of each of the brands being tested and then make their choice. Now suppose I were to ask you to test a soft drink a little differently. What if you were to take a case of the drink home and tell me what you think after a few weeks? Would that change your opinion? It turns out it would. Carol Dollard, who worked for Pepsi for many years in new product development, says, "I've seen many times when the CLT will give you one result and the home use test will give you the exact opposite. For example, in a CLT, consumers might taste 3 or 4 different products in a row, taking a sip or a couple sips of each. A sip is very different from sitting and drinking a whole beverage on your own. Sometimes a sip tastes good and a whole bottle doesn't. That's why home use tests give you the best information. The user isn't in an artificial setting. They are at home, sitting in front of the TV, and the way they feel in that situation is the most reflective of how they will behave when the product hits the market." Dollard says, for instance, that one of the biases in a sip test is towards sweetness. If you only test in a sip test, consumers will like the sweeter product. But when they have to drink a whole bottle or can, that sweetness can get really overpowering or cloying. Pepsi is sweeter than Coke, so right away it had a big advantage in a sip test. Pepsi is also characterized by a citrusy flavor burst, unlike the more raisiny vanilla taste of Coke. But that burst tends to dissipate over the course of an entire can, and that is another reason Coke suffered by comparison. Pepsi, in short, is a drink built to shine in a sip test. Does this mean that the Pepsi challenge was a fraud? Not at all. It just means that we have 2 different reactions to colas. We have one reaction after taking a sip, and we have another reaction after drinking a whole can. In order to make sense of people's cola judgments, we need to first decide which of those 2 reactions most interests us. Then there's the issue of what is called sensation transference. This is a concept coined by one of the great figures in 20th century marketing, a man named Louis Chaskin, who was born in Ukraine at the turn of the century and immigrated to the United States as a child. Chaskin was convinced that when people give an assessment of something they might buy in a supermarket or a department store, without realizing it, they transfer sensations or impressions that they have about the packaging of the product to the product itself. To put it another way, Chaskin believed that most of us don't make a distinction, on an unconscious level, between the package and the product. The product is the package and the product combined. One of the projects Chaskin worked on was margarine. In the late 1940s, margarine was not very popular. Consumers had no interest in either eating it or buying it. But Chase Skin was curious. Why didn't people like margarine? Was their problem with margarine intrinsic to the food itself? Or was it a problem with the associations people had with margarine? He decided to find out. In that era, margarine was white. Chase Skin colored it yellow so that it would look like butter. Then he staged a series of luncheons with homemakers. Because he wanted to catch people unawares, he didn't call the luncheons margarine testing luncheons. He merely invited a group of women to an event. My bet is that all the women wore little white gloves, says Davis Maston, who today is one of the principals in the consulting firm Chase Skin founded. Chase Skin brought in speakers and served food, and there were little pats of butter for some and little pats of margarine for others. The margarine was yellow. In the context of it, they didn't let people know there was a difference. Afterwards, everyone was asked to rate the speakers and the food, and it ended up that people thought the butter was just fine. Market research had said there was no future for margarine. Lewis said, "Let's go at this more indirectly." Now the question of how to increase sales of margarine was much clearer. Chase Skin told his client to call their product Imperial Margarine, so they could put an impressive-looking crown on the package. As he had learned at the luncheon, the color was critical. He told them the margarine had to be yellow. Then he told them to wrap it in foil, because in those days foil was associated with high quality. And sure enough, if they gave someone two identical pieces of bread, one buttered with white margarine and the other buttered with foil-wrapped yellow Imperial Margarine, the second piece of bread won hands down in taste tests every time. You never ask anyone, "Do you want foil or not?" because the answer is always going to be, "I don't know," or "Why would I?" says Maston. You just ask them which tastes better, and by that indirect method you get a picture of what their true motivations are. The Chase Skin Company demonstrated a particularly elegant example of sensation transference a few years ago, when they studied two competing brands of inexpensive brandy, Christian Brothers and E&J, the latter of which, to give some idea of the market segment to which the two belong, is known to its clientele as Easy Jesus. Their client, Christian Brothers, wanted to know why, after years of being the dominant brand in the category, it was losing market share to E&J. Their brandy wasn't more expensive. It wasn't harder to find in the store. And they weren't being out-advertised, since there is very little advertising at this end of the brandy segment. So, why were they losing ground? Chase Skin set up a blind taste test with 200 brandy drinkers. The two brandies came out roughly the same. Chase Skin then decided to go a few steps further. "We went out and did another test with 200 different people," explains Daryl Rhea, another principal in the firm. "This time we told people which glass was Christian Brothers and which glass was E&J. Now you are having sensation transference from the name, and this time Christian Brothers numbers are up." Clearly people had more positive associations with the name Christian Brothers than with E&J. That only deepened the mystery, because if Christian Brothers had a stronger brand, why were they losing market share? So, now we do another 200 people. This time the actual bottles of each brand are in the background. We don't ask about the packages, but they are there. And what happens? Now we get a statistical preference for E&J. So we've been able to isolate what Christian Brothers' problem is. The problem is not the product and it's not the branding. It's the package. Rhea pulled out a picture of the two brandy bottles as they appeared in those days. Christian Brothers looked like a bottle of wine. It had a long, slender spout and a simple off-white label. E&J, by contrast, had a far more ornate bottle, more squat, like a decanter, with smoked glass, foil wrapping around the spout, and a dark, richly textured label. To prove their point, Rhea and his colleagues did one more test. They served 200 people Christian Brothers brandy out of an E&J bottle, and E&J brandy out of a Christian Brothers bottle. Which brandy won? Christian Brothers, hands down, by the biggest margin of all. Now they had the right taste, the right brand, and the right bottle. The company redesigned their bottle to be a lot more like E&J's, and, sure enough, their problem was solved. Cheskin's offices are just outside San Francisco, and after we talked, Mastin and Rhea took me to a Nob Hill Farm supermarket down the street, one of those shiny, cavernous food emporia that populate the American suburbs. "We've done work in just about every aisle," Mastin said as we walked in. In front of us was the beverage section. Rhea leaned over and picked up a can of 7-Up. We tested 7-Up. We had several versions, and what we found is that if you add 15% more yellow to the green on the package, if you take this green and add more yellow, what people report is that the taste experience has a lot more lime or lemon flavor. And people were upset. "You are changing my 7-Up. Don't do a new Coke on me." It's exactly the same product, but a different set of sensations have been transferred from the bottle, which in this case isn't necessarily a good thing. From the cold beverage section, we wandered to the canned goods aisle. Mastin picked up a can of Chef Boyardee ravioli and pointed at the picture of the chef on the label of the can. His name is Hector. We know a lot about people like this, like Orville Redenbacher or Betty Crocker or the woman on the Sun-Made Raisins package. The general rule is, the closer consumers get to the food itself, the more consumers are going to be conservative. What that means for Hector is that in this case he needs to look pretty literal. You want to have the face as a recognizable human being that you can relate to. Typically, close-ups of the face work better than full-body shots. We tested Hector in a number of different ways. Can you make the ravioli taste better by changing him? Mostly you can blow it, like by making him a cartoon figure. We looked at him in the context of photography down to cartoon character kinds of things. The more you go to cartoon characters, the more of an abstraction Hector becomes, the less and less effective you are in perceptions of the taste and quality of the ravioli. Mastin picked up a can of Hormel canned meat. We did this, too. We tested the Hormel logo. He pointed at the tiny sprig of parsley between the R and the M. That little bit of parsley helps bring freshness to canned food. Rhea held out a bottle of Classico tomato sauce and talked about the meanings attached to various kinds of containers. When Del Monte took the peaches out of the tin and put them in a glass container, people said, "Ah, this is something like my grandmother used to make." People say peaches taste better when they come in a glass jar. It's just like ice cream in a cylindrical container as opposed to a rectangular package. People expect it's going to taste better and they are willing to pay 5-10 cents more, just on the strength of that package. What Mastin and Rhea do is tell companies how to manipulate our first impressions, and it's hard not to feel a certain uneasiness about their efforts. If you double the size of the chips in chocolate chip ice cream and say on the package, "New, bigger chocolate chips," and charge 5 to 10 cents more, that seems honest and fair. But if you put your ice cream in a round as opposed to a rectangular container and charge 5 to 10 cents more, that seems like you're pulling the wool over people's eyes. If you think about it, though, there really isn't any practical difference between those two things. We are willing to pay more for ice cream when it tastes better, and putting ice cream in a round container convinces us it tastes better just as surely as making the chips bigger in chocolate chip ice cream does. Sure, we're conscious of one improvement and not conscious of the other, but why should that distinction matter? Why should an ice cream company be able to profit only from improvements that we are conscious of? You might say, well, they're going behind our back. But who is going behind our back? The ice cream company, or our own unconscious? Neither Mastin nor Rhea believes that clever packaging allows a company to put out a bad-tasting product. The taste of the product itself matters a great deal. Their point is simply that when we put something in our mouth and in that blink of an eye decide whether it tastes good or not, we are reacting not only to the evidence from our taste buds and salivary glands but also to the evidence of our eyes and memories and imaginations, and it is foolish of a company to service one dimension and ignore the other. In that context, then, Coca-Cola's error with New Coke becomes all the more egregious. It wasn't just that they placed too much emphasis on sip tests. It was that the entire principle of a blind taste test was ridiculous. They shouldn't have cared so much that they were losing blind taste tests with Old Coke, and we shouldn't at all be surprised that Pepsi's dominance in blind taste tests never translated to much in the real world. Why not? Because in the real world, no one ever drinks Coca-Cola blind. We transfer to our sensation of the Coca-Cola taste all of the unconscious associations we have of the brand, the image, the can, and even the unmistakable red of the logo. The mistake Coca-Cola made, Ria says, was in attributing their loss in share to Pepsi entirely to the product. But what counts for an awful lot in colas is the brand imagery, and they lost sight of that. All their decisions were made on changing the product itself, while Pepsi was focusing on youth and making Michael Jackson their spokesman and doing a lot of good branding things. Sure, people like a sweeter product in a sip test, but people don't make their product decisions on sip tests. Coke's problem is that the guys in white lab coats took over. Did the guys in the white lab coats take over in Kenna's case as well? The market testers assumed that they could simply play one of his songs or part of one of his songs for someone over the telephone or on the internet, and the response of listeners would serve as a reliable guide to what music buyers would feel about the song. Their thinking was that music lovers can thin slice a new song in a matter of seconds, and there is nothing wrong with that idea in principle. But thin slicing has to be done in context. It is possible to quickly diagnose the health of a marriage. But you can't just watch a couple playing ping-pong. You have to observe them while they are discussing something of relevance to their relationship. It's possible to thin slice a surgeon's risk of being sued for malpractice on the basis of a small snippet of conversation. But it has to be a conversation with a patient. All of the people who warmed to Kenna had that kind of context. The people at the Roxy and the No Doubt concert saw him in the flesh. Craig Coleman had Kenna sing for him, right there in his office. Fred Durst heard Kenna through the prism of one of his trusted colleagues' excitement. The viewers of MTV who requested Kenna over had seen his video. Judging Kenna without that additional information is like making people choose between Pepsi and Coke in a blind taste test. Thank you for tuning into part 2 of Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. Malcolm Gladwell's insights into the art of snap judgments continue to challenge how we perceive decision-making in our everyday lives. If you enjoyed this audiobook, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Stay tuned for the next part, where we delve even deeper into the fascinating science of intuition. Until then, happy listening and keep thinking smart.